Hey guys, GhazzyTV here with another Diablo 4 content video. In this one, I'm going to talk about my beloved minion archetype builds in the actual ARPG game. During the early access, we didn't have access to neither Druid nor Necromancer, and I was a little bit bummed out because I love the minion archetype in these type of games. Obviously, in the next weekend, I'll be going ham on both Necromancer and Druid and seeing what kind of builds we can create, because that is something I'll be focusing on when it comes to content on this channel. But I went deep diving into the Sorcerer's skill tree and found out a really cool CDR stacking way, which actually meant we could actually make a minion related build that performs extremely well. So far I've been able to tank the world boss Ashava completely deathless, didn't even bother taking any damage, had no problems with it. I was able to basically feel unkillable throughout the entire campaign section that we have access to, and doing respectable damage. There's a couple of variations you can do for even further defensive focuses or more offensive focus. What's really cool with this build is simply that when it comes to party play, this build is crowd controlling and putting up the vulnerability debuff so that they take a ton of extra damage, and also having in the offensive strategy able to group enemies up. This is a great way to play with parties and other sorcerers as well, especially if they go with a cold damage focus. So enough talk about this, let me show you the build in action and show you the type of skill trees that we're running with in this build. Now, for those of you who are interested in actually trying this build out, I'll try to explain the way the mechanics actually work. And first things first, during the early access, we only have access to one of our enchantments, and as you can see on all of our abilities, the enchantment effect is what's listed in the bottom. For example, for Spark, saying killing an enemy has 10% chance to form a crackling energy. And if you then take a look at the Firebolt, it will tell me that the direct damage from the skill applies to an additional 98% burning damage over 8 seconds. Now, why this is important is that a lot of our build design comes from not just legendary unique power effects, but also things like the enchantments on our actual skills. Now, that is a combination that will determine how we're going to play certain builds in this game. For example, we are going to be using ice shards, whereas we have a unique item effect that allows this to pierce enemies. This is why the gathering enemies up with Inferno is such a cool thing to do for this build. It's not necessary to have the ice shards piercing, but together with Inferno, that enhances that effect even further. So for this build, we'll be using the Ice Blades enchantment. The reason for this is that Ice Blade's cooldown is reduced by 1 second each time it hits a vulnerable enemy. Since we are looking to summon as many Ice Blades as possible, that means that, and also make sure that we apply vulnerability on hit as much as we can versus frozen or chilled enemies, we're going to be able to create a scenario where we apply tons of summons during the short amount of time that these minions stay up for life. And in this case, you can see that we'll be dragging down the cooldown quite extensively. Most importantly though, 50% of the enhanced Ice Blades cooldown reduction is applied to your other skills. This is why I will be running the Ice Blade enchantment instead of anything else. You could skip the minion approach because Ice Blades is this build's minions, and simply use the Ice Shards enchantment, which means that Ice Shards automatically conjure and fly towards frozen enemies. This is not something we'll be focusing on. We will be focusing on the minion build for this approach, and therefore using the Ice Blade enchantment. Another thing to point out is that any sort of hits that causes or hits against vulnerable enemies or frozen enemies is very, very good. And the main reason Ice Shards is there is simply because of the fact that it shoots out 5 shards. Each shard counts as an individual hit. So you can actually apply a certain amount of hits by just casting Ice Shards. Even more so with piercing if you get that, which is really nice. The modifiers for Ice Shards is that we're running a 50% chance of ricochet to another enemy, and they also ricochet off of frozen enemies. And most importantly, hitting an enemy with 5 Ice Shards in a single cast makes them vulnerable for 2 seconds, which is how we deliver our single target surging damage output. Outside of that, we're going to go through the actual skill play. So basically our rotation is very, very simple. Since the idea is to summon as many Ice Blades as possible, we will then be casting out Ice Blades, as you can see in the gameplay footage, and then we'll be teleporting into a pack of enemy and casting Frost Nova, and therefore making the enemies frozen. And after this, you also have to keep in mind that the modifiers from Frost Nova in our tree is making the enemies vulnerable. And at this point, we will then be casting out our Ice Armor, which you can cast before the Frost Nova, doesn't matter, to make sure that we have another cooldown or ability on cooldown. And then after that, all we do is spam ice shards unless we have any other ability off cooldown. So essentially the rotation is to make sure that our ice blades is always on cooldown, because that is how we summon our minions, and then make sure that we're using Frost Nova at any given time we are packing up a single target damage or have a bunch of enemies around us, or simply because it is off cooldown. However, if you have the unique power to give it 2 charges, don't cast it twice back to back. Make sure you cast it if they're not frozen, and then using ice bear armor in between, and then spamming out ice shard as a last resort. If you don't have the highest level available in early access, then you will not be using Inferno, but rather will be using the basic Frost Bolt, as seen in the 2 links to this build planner in the descriptions below. This is simply because the idea of using the Frost Bolt in the early stages allows you to use it against a frozen enemy, which will then make that enemy vulnerable. That's another way for us to apply that. In the gameplay footage you are watching, I do not have the legendary power that allows me to automatically apply vulnerability on hit versus frozen or I believe chilled enemies, which is a very, very strong power source for this character. It's something I wanted to look into. Have not gotten it so far. However, once you have that, the gameplay doesn't really change. The only time something changes is when you're max level in the early access availability. We will stop using the basic attack and switch that out for an Inferno, or the Deep Freeze if you so choose to run the more defensive approach to this build. And that basically sums up the rotation. So the TLDR version is keep ice plates on cooldown at any given time. Make sure you hit frozen enemies. And if you're doing a single target, you'll be making sure the enemy is frozen if it's possible, and then using Ice Shard. But Ice Shard is literally the last priority of skills you want to use. You want to make sure ice plates on cooldown, use your Frost Nova, your Ice Armor, and when your teleport before you're using your Ice Shards. And the simple reason for this is that if you're spamming Ice Shard, you're going to have mana issues in the end. Like I mentioned earlier, gearing and whatnot is not a big problem in terms of cost reduction and cooldown reduction. That's something you'll be looking into. You can get them across the board in your entire gear set here and there. I believe the boots have the cost reduction available to them, whereas you have things like cooldown reduction and cost reduction on other pieces, and having increased damage and reduced damage taken from enemies that are nearby is another way to make yourself tanky. Again, gearing in early access doesn't really matter. I didn't want to make this a guide video per se, because again, we're super limited in the first and second week of testing this game out. But if you're interested, that's the basic TLDR of how this build is played. Hope you enjoy. So when it comes to the skill tree, I have 2 different links in the descriptions below. One is a bare bone initial start with just a couple of lower levels and the max level during the early access, and the other link is to a full-fledged end game type of approach of the early access game. Now, I do want to point out that we only have the first act, so this is by no means any sort of build guide. It is by no means something I would recommend playing in the full release. This is something that has been working out and been very fun to play throughout the early access of the game. And it also is a really cool way for me to play minions, as I love doing this in the wait for necromancers and druids. So in this first bare bone strategy, we're simply going to be taking the Frostbolt and the 2 left side into Flickering Frostbolt and Enhanced Frostbolt, and picking up 1 point in Ice Shard, as well as Enhanced Ice Shards and Destructive Ice Shards, which will be our main single target damage output. When it comes to the defensive side, we will be taking Teleport, obviously, with 1 point Ice Armor, Enhanced Ice Armor, Shimmering Ice Armor, and then the Frost Nova into the Enhanced and Mystical Frost Nova. And on the Conjuration, we'll be putting a redundant amount of points into Ice Blades and taking the Summon Ice Blades together with Enhanced Ice Blades, and also the using cooldown, granting 20% of your maximum life as barrier. This allows us to have a consistent barrier all the time on our character, being pretty much immortal, and it's just so smooth to play. Outside of that, the mastery, we're taking a couple points into the snap freeze and stuff like that, just to get the points in to be able to get to the ultimate. Now, the defensive version would pick up the deep freeze and into prime deep freeze, which is really not needed in the current state of the early access, but I went with the Inferno, as you can see in the gameplay footage. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about the approach of the skill tree. They're listed in the descriptions below, and instead tell you guys all about the feelings I had with this build and the early access, which we already made an initial gameplay footage video with my first impressions. here on my YouTube channel. There's a link to that one in the descriptions below. Instead of talking about the game and the early access approach in this video, I'm going to talk about the actual build diversity when it comes to minions. Now, from what I've seen, it looks like necromancers are going to be in a position where we are expected to see similarities to the Diablo 3 necromancer playstyle, which means that permanent minion gameplay that we all love from the pure ARPG genre will not be something we'll be looking into or expecting too much, but rather the more temporarily summon minions gameplay type of approach to the build, which means more death-like abilities or even poison-oriented approach will be something we'll be looking at, which also gets me rather interested in and curious about how they're going to do it with the druid, which I haven't looked into too much myself. Either way, with these things out of the way, I'm actually very excited for the open beta coming up in the next weekend. So if you're liking minion builds and you're actually looking forward to playing those type of archetypes in Diablo 4, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe for more content. I'll keep you guys up to date with what I can find. But for now, enjoy the Sorcerer's minion build that's available in the actual Diablo 4 early access game. And if you'd like to try this out on the next weekend, let me know how you guys liked it in the comments below, and I'll check them out. Till next time, as always, stay safe, keep rocking.